All right, thanks, Jen. As Jen said, my name is Brian Crawford, and today I want to really just hopefully advance the conversation about advocacy just a little bit and bring in some of all the messy, complicated feelings and beliefs we have about this topic. And I want to do so by bringing in just a little bit of data that I collected last year with these two other Warnell grad students. And what's especially fun about this is that this data comes from students and faculty just like you all at UGA. So feel free to sit back and judge your colleagues as we start to see some of their attitudes, and then you can see how your own attitudes stack up against theirs. So to start, I just want to pose one question to all of you, think it through. I'm sure we've all thought about this before. It's kind of the big question. It's what are we doing? What are we doing and what should we be doing as scientists? Of course, there's no one answer to this, but a lot of scientists might feel most comfortable conducting research, publishing their results, and contributing to environmental policy or contributing to the general body of knowledge that then informs environmental policies. Still, others may want to jump out of the lab, become an activist at points in their life, and really fight for a particular policy that they believe in. Others might want to actually sit at the table and get to decide which policies get made and which get thrown out. And still others may want to find a middle ground there and conduct research, but then bring these results to policymakers and work a little more closely with them. Now, you probably already guessed that the answer to this question is not either or for a lot of us. It's really both and. And you can imagine doing any combination of these roles, or maybe some of the overachievers in the room might want to try all of these roles, depending on the context or the stage of the career you're in, et cetera. But our choices, the way we answer this question definitely has huge impacts on ourselves, our careers, and society. So that's why this question really isn't nothing new. I'm not bringing anything new to the table here. And in fact, it's been discussed ad nauseum in the literature for the past 2 to 3 decades, and probably longer than that. And when you dive into this stuff, one word starts to emerge that carries with it a lot of controversy. And that's what we're going to talk about today, advocacy. Now, before we know how to advance the conversation about advocacy, we need to look at this picture, figure out what's missing. So that's what my 2 fellow students and I did, and we found 2 things that were a little interesting and surprising. First, a lot of these papers are really good editorials, have many insightful comments and perspectives, but very few studies have gone out and collected data across a pretty broad sample of scientists and gotten their opinions into the conversation. And secondly, no study that we found has ever examined the perspectives of students like us that are about to enter their careers in natural resources and other fields. So as students, our concern is that if our attitudes differ than those of established professionals, it could create some real challenges as we enter these fields, collaborate with these people, and eventually as one generation replaces the next, what's going to happen? So seeing these gaps, these knowledge gaps, we set out to just collect some exploratory research where we measured and compared the attitudes across 5 groups from students to professionals. And so for the rest of the talk, we're going to cover 3 things. We're going to cover advocacy, what is it? Attitudes, how we feel about it, what we believe it is. And then applications, what does this all mean, especially for students? That'll be the focus. And what needs to change, if anything. So before I get into those 3 sections, I just want to give you a little background into how we collected the data. We just conducted a pretty standard sociological survey that we distributed online through listservs that we had access to. And you see using this, the response rate was not great, but it was comparable to other studies that used this methodology. And in total, we were able to get about 250 responses across our groups. So who do we send this to? Well, the first 3 groups were all at UGA, undergrads, grads, and faculty. Mostly in the natural resources, biological sciences departments. But we didn't stop there. We actually sent it around to government and non-government organizations that we had contacts with, felt comfortable giving them the survey, and they would distribute it for us. And I should say most of those organizations were in the Southeast, but there were a few exceptions, like California Fish and Wildlife. So that's who we surveyed. Now, the first main topic that we had them respond to was, how do we define advocacy? Because even that is an incredible unresolved issue in the literature. A part of that is because the dictionary is actually no help at all. This is a pretty terrible definition. And we know that in practice, a lot of us use advocacy in all different ways. And we've really adopted sort of more of a continuum of definitions that are very context-specific and a lot more complex. So on one side of the continuum, more passive activities like conducting research, publishing your results, these are viewed as standard scientific practices by a lot of people. But if you dig in a little bit, some people would argue that there are ingrained forms of advocacy in there as well. On the other end, more active roles like leading advocacy groups are much more unanimously viewed as advocacy. And of course, there's a ton of actions in the middle there that are also debatable. So with this in mind, we presented 10 of these actions to our respondents and asked to what degree do you think that this is an example of advocacy? And we did this before we defined advocacy for them on the survey. So let's see what the professionals said first. So here we have faculty in light gray, NGOs in dark gray, and government folks in black. Now, we can get into the weeds here and discuss how groups differed for any one item, but for now, I just want to keep it simple and look at the general trend. Because as you can see, we ordered these in a certain way, so they generally agreed, all three of these groups, that actions near the top were not believed to constitute advocacy, and towards the bottom, there was much stronger agreement that these were examples of advocacy. So towards the top, you have things like accepting funds from government agencies, publishing in scientific journals, things like that. Those were less viewed as advocacy. And then writing to Congress about a policy or providing leadership for a group. Those were more unanimously viewed as advocacy. So given the professionals' opinions, where did our students fall? Well, kind of surprisingly or interesting, grad students kind of fell it was pretty consistent with what the professionals viewed on these topics. However, not the same for undergrads. So to undergrads, everything is advocacy, which is pretty interesting. So another way to look at these results a little closer is if we just take away that and look what's happening within the academic groups. So one way to interpret them is to look at what portion of the scale they're using down here. So you see the mean responses from faculty and to a lesser extent grad students are covering a pretty good portion of the scale, and they seem to be distinguishing between activities that are and are not advocacy. But again, to undergrads, everything's advocacy. They're using a very narrow portion. They agree, at least somewhat, that all these actions are a form of advocacy. So what's going on here? Well, this is very debatable without further information, further research. But one interpretation might be that, remember I said these definitions are pretty context specific. So it's reasonable to believe that faculty have had a broader set of experiences at their stage of the careers, and they may have a larger context on which to judge what these activities actually look like in practice, and undergrads just don't have that yet. So that's where we think why there might be some pretty big difference in how these groups define advocacy. And one last thing I'll point out, it's kind of interesting that grad students' responses kind of fall in the middle there. And that's the stage of our careers where we're getting more experience, more of that context in doing things like publishing, presenting results, things like that. So we're starting to gain a little better context of what these things actually look like. Again, we can debate that. Hopefully we'll have time for questions at the end. But for now, let's move on to how groups felt about what scientists should be doing. So in the next section, we measured attitudes towards these 9 general roles or responsibilities of scientists. Now for this one, I'm going to bring in our results by item, not by group, because groups really had pretty tight agreement. They responded very close to each other on each of these items. So we found that groups generally agreed, pretty strongly agreed, that scientists should be engaging in advocacy to improve policies, or at least working closely with policymakers and managers. They somewhat agreed that scientists should be doing things like be credible experts or receive training to be effective advocates. But they were more neutral that this advocacy thing should be an obligation to scientists. And then lastly, they pretty much disagreed across groups that advocacy should be something to be avoided at all costs by scientists. So it might not be surprising to a lot of you in this room, but these 3 boxes, the results within these 3 boxes kind of demonstrate that scientists in our sample, students and professionals, are getting more comfortable with the idea of scientists moving out of their traditional isolated roles in those silos that we always talk about and engaging more with policymakers, managers, and doing at least some form of what we might call advocacy. So this is pretty interesting. And before we know how to apply these results, I want to give you one last piece of evidence that we found, and that involves training. So across all groups we sampled, even the professionals, the majority lacked training on advocacy science relationships, but I didn't show these results, but the majority of them were also interested in receiving it. So now we have a lack of training, but some pretty good support and willingness to receive this training. So with that, I just wanted to throw out, where do we go from here? Our own ideas, mine and my co-authors. And so we think that given this data, beginning training at the undergrad level seems most appropriate. And so we might build into the curriculum some discussion-based courses. I think given the contentious nature of advocacy, getting just open discussions going about what you think about it, what your colleagues think about it, seems like the best course of action here. And within those courses, just to flesh out this idea a little bit more, we could get different perspectives about how groups define advocacy, what actions are acceptable or unacceptable for scientists, get some cross-pollination of perspectives going, and then also use it as an opportunity that if students want to take on more active roles in engaging in these audiences that are not just other scientists, give them practice in writing, communicating with these audiences while still maintaining a lot of that scientific integrity. And then also we could try and get them that context, that experience that faculty have maybe secondhand by going through some case studies of other folks that have advocated or taken on these different roles and a balanced discussion of the positives and negatives. Now, lastly, I'm really excited to say that these aren't just recommendations at this point, because in, less than a month, I have to give 2 lessons in an undergrad class in Warnell working with Gary Green. And it's going to be very cool. I'm doing that as part of a SOTL teaching project. And we're going to institute these lessons and actually measure students' changes in knowledge and attitudes towards these topics. So I don't want to leave out the other groups, but these courses should not just be for undergrads. Of course, grads would benefit as well, figuring out what we think and what our colleagues think about these topics. And some inner-level perspectives sharing would be good, too. Also, I don't know if you guys have heard about this program, but this is kind of what we do. We have so many opportunities here, and as other programs like ours develop, there's going to be more opportunities to, if you want to, if you so choose, to get out there and try out some of these different roles. Don't want to leave the professionals out, but the majority of professionals that we surveyed were members of professional societies. And if they don't want to start engaging in more active roles, a good indirect way would be to just contribute to the societies that do sort of contribute to policy a little more directly. So the take-home message is this. I think if we want to better answer this question that I posed in the beginning, we really need to know at least how to define advocacy and how others view our actions as acceptable or unacceptable. And so then we can move forward in taking on these choices, but sort of know what we're getting into, knowing the positives and negatives, and knowing what the perspectives are from the colleagues that we're going to work with. So with that, I'd love to get your opinions. If we don't have time for questions, I know everyone has opinions about this topic, so I left my email address up there. Would love to hear any and all feedback. So thank you guys very much. Yeah.
So I kind of believe that your sample kind of looks like an ontogeny of people in it. But do you think the undergraduates represent the general public? In this,
like in this stuff?
The reason I ask that then is, there is this issue right now of whether or not, just by the act of doing science, you are being an advocate.
Mm-hmm.
And we tend to think of that as being objective. Which one of those groups is delusional?
First question, take them one at a time here. I think the undergrads in their attitude, in the next slide about their attitudes supporting advocacy, I think that 100% represents the general public. I think we've heard a lot of increasing calls from the general public too, for scientists to at least be not isolated, but be more engaged in policy formation. So I would agree that they represent the public on that. With how they define advocacy, I have no reason not to believe they represent sort of the more uninformed general public. If that makes sense. That might be too harsh, but I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And who's right, objective or subjective science? Is that your second question?
Yeah, like, are they right that really when we publish research, we are advocates?
I think there's a lot of embedded advocacy that we don't think about a lot. So yeah, the who's right thing, I kind of skirted around that. But I think no matter, without asserting that one group is right or not, still doing things like instituting a broader discussion, training beginning at the undergrad level is going to help at least be aware of what other perspectives are out there. So, that was sort of a half answer, sorry.
Great, thank you so much.